Hello, the title of this talk is Biology on the Brink. It's about an article called Climate Change is Not the Principal Driver of Biodiversity Loss. I'm going to be referring to an article called An Inconvenient Misconception. Climate change is not the principal driver of biodiversity loss. It's written by Tim Caro and others. It's published in the Journal of Conservation Letters, and I'll be reading key parts of it. The idea is that we depend on biologists to tell us from a scientific standpoint what's really happening with the loss of species and what the true causes are. And it is a problem if biologists are not really sticking to their guns by telling us what the real causes of biodiversity loss are. The real causes of biodiversity loss are loss of habitat and pollution, overhunting, overfishing. Loss of habitat includes deforestation. It includes the expansion of agriculture, but not would be fine if it was the expansion of regenerative agriculture. But when you have the expansion of a type of agriculture that leaves no room for wildlife, then that's a problem. So we depend on scientists to tell us the truth about this, but this article is written by conservation biologists, and it makes the case that conservation biologists are kind of asleep at the wheel is not the right metaphor, but they're derelict of duty. They are abandoning their post by hitching their wagon to a narrative that says climate change is the reason for it. Now, if you watched my other video on a similar topic, you say he's saying the very same thing he did before. I promise you this will be a little bit different, but it is on a related topic. Let's get into this article and see what it has to say. So it is called An Inconvenient Misconception. Climate change is not the principal driver of biodiversity loss in the Society for Conservation Biology. I'm going to be quoting from the article. Climate change is now on everyone's itinerary. Now, keep in mind that this is conservation biologists critiquing their own profession. It says climate change is now on everyone's itinerary, but we are concerned that threats to biodiversity are increasingly seen through the single myopic lens of climate change, dwarfing conventional conservation threats. So what are the conventional conservation threats? In other words, what are those things, especially those things that human beings are doing, that are causing the decline of wildlife populations? They include habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, agricultural expansion, overexploitation, which means mainly overhunting and overfishing, and pollution and invasive species. Pollution, I think, should include agricultural chemicals. So agriculture shows up in at least two of those places, and then invasive species. During the last 30 years, the proportion of scientific papers addressing climate change and global warming as being anthropogenic drivers, in other words, human-caused drivers of climate change in patterns of biodiversity, has steadily increased. In other words, over the last 30 years, more and more papers asserting or holding or finding that climate change is a driver of biodiversity loss. But we're going to see that that's not really the case. Media coverage on climate change in relation to biodiversity has followed similar trends over this period and is currently standing more than 3 times higher than related stories on pollution, disease, and deforestation. Now, it's climate change in the media coverage is 3 times higher, but in reality, it's the other drivers of biodiversity loss that are 3 times higher. So the rhetoric is climate change is the big problem. The reality is that these other drivers of biodiversity loss are the big problem. Concern among the public about climate change has been so successful that some conservationists now argue that it is too late to stop this distortion. At best, we can only hitch the other horsemen of the apocalypse to this runaway bandwagon. Honestly, I don't quite get that metaphor. But we found that for the extinct in the wild category of amphibian species, there were 12 extinctions listing 27 causes, but only 11% of these reported climate change, whereas 37% listed habitat loss. So habitat loss was 3.5 times as much as frequently reported as a cause of extinctions for these 12 extinctions of amphibian species. Now, here's some other species, including mammals, birds, and reptiles. The same pattern holds for the 9 reptile species extinctions, 42 bird extinctions, 21 mammal extinctions, 12%, 3%, and 12% respectively reported that climate change as a precipitating factor, whereas habitat loss amounted to 29%, 35%, and 37% respectively. So a rough look at those numbers shows that, habitat loss is at least like 3 times as big of a factor as opposed to climate change. Think about birds. Think about the habitat that birds need. Birds need, they need trees, most of them, not all of them. Some of them need trees, some of them nest in shrubs and on the ground, but whatever plants they need in shrubs or on the ground, if those plants are eliminated, then you're talking about loss of habitat means a loss of that species. And it's a much more direct, rather than temperatures alone. Yeah, temperatures can be an issue, but if you eliminate the plant matter that they need to dwell in, then you're going to, it's a much more direct assault on their life, their livelihood, the way that they make a living. So the same pattern holds. In every case, habitat loss exceeds climate change risk by a factor of 3 or more. So the coverage is one thing. The coverage says climate change is 3 times as much because of, but the reality is that these other factors, mainly habitat loss, are at least 3 times as big of a factor in the loss of these species. So the majority of listed drivers of population declines were agriculture, production of crops, livestock farming, aquaculture, and tree cultivation. Those are all forms of agriculture: crops, livestock, tree cultivation, and aquaculture are all forms of agriculture. And biological resource use, overexploitation of species through hunting, for example. The relative magnitude of threats due to land use change. Land use change is another way of saying we're degrading the land, we're degrading the ecosystems on the land. So the relative magnitude of threats due to land use change versus climate change, again, suggests the former exceeds the latter by 3 to 10 times. So what's up with the media coverage if the actuality, I keep doing this, here's the reporting, here's the reality. So what's up with the reporting, and not just the media coverage, but also the reporting by conservation biologists? Our analyses demonstrate that climate change is not the dominant factor responsible for declining vertebrate populations. Instead, loss of biodiversity is driven by a combination of several important actions dominated by land use change and overexploitation. And that's the, oops, what have I done here? That is the end of what I'm quoting you there. Okay, so Reese says turtle dove down over 90% in UK when their favored tree type disappeared. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Whatever their favorite tree type is, there's a correlation between the loss of trees and the loss of birds that depend on those particular trees. There's a correlation between the loss of shrubs and the birds that depend on those particular shrubs. There's a correlation between the loss of grassland habitat and the birds, mammals, reptiles, etc., that depend on that particular grassland habitat. So anyway, I've always said in my climate report radio show and in my reporting, my number one job is to separate rhetoric from reality. And there's a big disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. So that's all I have. I hope this has been helpful. Have a great day.